In this video, I'm going to walk you through the step-by-step installation procedure for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator Kit for the 2018 Kawasaki Ninja 400. Now here at Vagabond Motorsports, we like to think our Fender Eliminator kits are both the most comprehensive in terms of it's a fully plug-and-play kit. We give you all the hardware you need and we give you all the instructions you need to confidently do the job. But it's also the most OEM grade kit available on the market. When I say OEM grade, I mean, we start by laser scanning the tail section of the motorcycle to pick up all the important features, whether it's the little boss that comes through with the wires or the bolt pattern, or even that kind of triangular pocket that this Fender Eliminator is going to sit directly inside of. But also with respect to some of the details of the kit, which include single piece, CNC laser cut, CNC formed piece of aluminum, coated in satin black, UV resistant powder coat. So it's going to be very durable and match the bike's kind of textures on the undertail very well. We are going to press in Penn Engineering studs as opposed to shipping you a bunch of loose hardware, so the install is one, a lot easier because this pattern is already fixed, and two, easier because you're not messing around with a bunch of loose nuts and bolts during this process. You can see we've got patterns or cutouts in the turn signals and the license plate specifically for the OEM lights from Kawasaki, so you can carry over your high quality DOT lights for this install. But also we're adding little details like rubber bumpers in the license plate flange to minimize license plate buzzing and cracking, and we're including everything you need to finish the kit off, including 4 flange locking nuts in a rubber grommet that's going to seal out water and road grime on the 3 cable looms coming into the tail section of the bike. This kit is proudly made here in Southern California, and we're confident that it's the best kit on the market for the Ninja 400. As for tools you need for this installation, you'll start with a 5mm Allen key. Either a T-handle or an L key will be good. 10mm socket with a short extension on a ratchet. A Phillips head screwdriver. I also would recommend a Phillips bit in a 1/4 inch socket so you can use it on your ratchet as a right angle. If you also have a right angle screwdriver, that'll be really useful. The only other thing that I'd recommend, it's not 100% required, is a small flathead screwdriver to help you disconnect the OEM electrical connectors. Makes things a lot easier. I'm going to be running a few extra bits of this style of tool in the power driver just to speed things up, but you don't have to do that. We're going to start the removal of the factory rear fender by removing the rider seat, or the passenger seat. So when you twist the key, pop the front of the latch, and then pull or push the seat forward towards the front of the bike off its 2 rear tabs. Set that aside and pull the key. Now under the rear passenger seat there's this black plastic tray. It's got hinges on the front, and if you kind of flex this rear tab, you can release the rear catch. Underneath that there's this black rubber boot that's got 3 connectors that you need to remove for the factory rear fender for your 2 turn signals and your license plate light. This is going to be a little bit of a trick. It's probably going to be harder to see, but start by rolling that boot forward, I suppose, and you'll expose the connectors. Now 2 of the connectors are going to be exactly the same. One's going to be gray, one's going to be black, exactly the same shape. You can push to release on the very, I guess, forward end, which is kind of hard considering there's not a lot of access. I like to use a really small flathead screwdriver to lift the catch, and that will allow you to do that without just, so it's going to be, hopefully you can catch it without burying your hands in there. Now there's going to be one more connector for the license plate light that is not that same style. Let's see if we can get you out for a camera. Now that one has an actual tooth on the connector, and you're actually just going to have to squeeze the front of it, squeeze that tooth down, and release it from its little hoop. So once you've got those 3 free, you can actually just work them out with the tail light of this little U-shaped grommet. And that grommet can stay, we're going to reuse it, you know, push it back in there. But once these guys are disconnected, the fender is ready to be unbolted. So they're going to be 4 5mm button head socket head cap screws, so they're kind of rounded heads. So you're going to take your 5mm Allen key. I've got this in a power driver just to speed things up. Remove them one by one. I would always recommend these have been. Make sure you loosen each bolt at least a little bit before you remove them all. Otherwise you have the chance that you're going to bind up the factory threads. So once you get the systems kind of loose, support the fender with one hand and remove the other two. And just try not to back the bolts out so far that they go tumbling down to the tail section of the bike. So you can see once they're loose, the bolts will kind of sit down. We'll take those out separately. Then feed the 3 connectors gently through the rectangular hole in the fender. And then we can take the factory fender to a bench and break it apart. Now once you got the factory fender off the bike, start by removing the license plate. Now every dealer is going to give you slightly different hardware here. In this case it's Phillips head screws and some standard hex nuts on the back that are 7/16 or 11 millimeters. So keep that hardware, you're going to reuse it. After you've got the license plate off, you've got 4 more 5 millimeter hex head, or sorry, Allen key bolts that we've got to remove. Now these are historically going to be really tight. They may or may not have thread locker on them, but you're going to want a nice non-ball end, because that often will gall up the bolts and spin them out. Nice key, and just use that to at least loosen them before you switch to the power driver, just because you really don't want to get in a scenario where you mess up one of these bolts. Not because we're going to reuse them, but because they'll prevent you from getting the lights out of the factory fender. So once you've loosened them all, you certainly can switch to a power driver. Now, we're not going to reuse any of this hardware, but you'll notice if you want to keep it, you have to keep track of it. There's going to be these little steel inserts inside the plastic. That's what allows it to tighten up so much without cracking the plastic. So keep track of these guys. I usually put the factory fenders back together and store them just in case I ever need to go back to factory. Now, once you've got that, all these little inserts are going to tumble out. So you should have 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. So there'll be 4 of these little steel cores that you can keep with the factory bolts. Once you've gotten to that point, what you can do is thread out all the wiring connectors. Let's start with the license plate light and then the turn signals. What that's going to allow you to do is, if you work all these connectors out, you're going to have one more through this grommeted circular hole for the license plate light. You can get this big steel backbone out and get access to all the features that allow you to take the lights out of this thing. So once you've got the steel backbone out of the fender shell, from this point on, everything we take out we're going to reinstall into the fender eliminator. So definitely try not to damage or lose anything. We're going to start by taking the license plate light out, which are these 2 Phillips head screws kind of buried down in there. And these are going to be thread cutting screws, so they're going to be threading directly into plastic bosses, so they'll have a very specific thread pitch on them. What that means is they're never really going to get loose, they're just going to feel tight the whole way out. Once you get the 2 screws out, simply pull the license plate light out. Those are the 2 bosses that you're threading into, but there's going to be a grommet that we want and these little steel washer stacks. We're definitely keep the washer stacks because that allows that bushing to be nice and tight as opposed to real sloppy. And then you're going to take these 2 rubber inserts out, and I usually just push a corner of them out and then they kind of pop out. So these are relatively easy to remove, and you're going to want to do that on both sides, obviously. And you'll start to notice that the Vagabond Fender Eliminator, there we go, pop those 2 guys out, is going to share that same geometry here. So everything's going to get reinstalled really easily back into the Fender Eliminator. Now once you got the license plate light out, we just have the turn signals. Kawasaki turn signals on almost older new bikes are on a full grommet, so rubber mount, but there's this two-piece steel retainer that holds the whole thing in, so you can't just pop them out. Now there's a Phillips head screw that holds that top retaining plate on. Now you can use a Phillips head screwdriver. It helps to kind of spread the fender kind of open a little bit to get as straight an engagement as possible. It's pretty difficult to do that. I always recommend if you either have a Phillips bit in just a small 1/4 inch drive, or for example like a 1/4 inch U-joint, so you can get dead straight engagement with the Phillips bit. That's always going to be preferred, just because these are fairly easy to round out and you want to avoid doing that. But if you can get straight access, and from Kawasaki to Kawasaki, these are either going to be really hard or very easy to get out. But you're going to pull the Phillips head screw out, set that aside, take the top retaining plate out, also set that aside, and then there's going to be an interior plate that you can either pry out with your finger or just grab a screwdriver to give you some leverage. Pop that guy out. Then you can thread that off the electrical connector, and all you're left with now is the rubber gasket holding the turn signal in place. These are actually split at the front of the gasket, so you're going to want to grasp kind of as much of the turn signal as possible and rotate it out towards like the front of the bike. Now I say that, you can see that there's a little bit less material here at the, I guess, the light side of the, or the lens side of the turn signal. So that's going to just allow it to release a little easier. So you're just going to kind of pull it back that way. Now once you've got one out, you do have straight on access to the other screw, which makes it much less likely to strip out. Once you remove that, same story. Take the top plate off, use a screwdriver to help you, just don't pinch the wires, pop out that inner plate, thread it off the connector, and then grasp the kind of lens side or the clear side of the turn signal and pull back, and you'll pop it out of the shell. Set the shell aside. I like to reassemble everything from the factory so it's easy to store in one place. At that point, we are going to be ready to begin assembly onto the fender eliminator. And this is largely going to be a rehash of, or at least the reverse process of everything we just did on the factory fender. Now we'll start the fender eliminator assembly process with the turn signals, and just like when you're removing the turn signals, you kind of grab the lens part and pull back, excuse me. We're going to start by threading the connector through, seating the narrow end in the groove of the fender eliminator, and then pushing it. So you're just reversing that motion. You should be able to snap the license plate or turn signal into the flange on the fender eliminator. Then we're going to thread on the nut plate, and that you're going to want to start by seating the narrow end. I usually hold it kind of in with one finger and then rocking the whole assembly in, and you should kind of be able to press it into position and see that it's gone under. There's 4 little rubber teeth that it needs to sit under. Once you've got that, you just cover that. There's a little tooth that goes into corresponding notch in that plate, and the Phillips, the small black Phillips head screw installs. And just like the removal, when you have one side, you can go in with your Phillips directly through, and that'll get you the opportunity to really seat that very securely. And obviously when you're setting the tight finishing torque, really kind of push into that so you don't strip that out. Now for the other one, in this case the right signal, we are going to rotate it into position, complete the whole process with the nut plate, seating the nut plate on the, let's see if you can see, seat the narrow end, kind of hold it in with your thumb, and then press, not quite, try that again, seat the narrow end under two of the little teeth, cover it, and there we go. Push it in. So you should get it fully covered by those four teeth, rubber teeth on the turn signal. Thread in your Phillips, and here you can, again, like I said, come in at an angle. Be very careful not to just run the screwdriver up and down the edge of that Fender Eliminator flange, because you'll just rub all the powder coating off. So again, if you have access to like a right angle drive, you can even just get a very simple right angle screwdriver, obviously in tighten rather than loosen in this mode. You should feel that it get tight, and that's just gonna squeeze those two flanges together. These are going to be ultra secure now. So once those guys are on, I will move on to the license plate light. Now, we took these two D-shaped grommets out of the factory fender, and we're going to jam them back in to the cutouts in the Fender Eliminator. And it's not a really glorious process. You kind of just start with one part of the grommet and shove it into the hole, and then you will kind of clock them so that they're not covering up that circular central hole for the connector. So get one. There we go. Cram it into the hole. And just double check on the backside that you're not kind of folded over on yourself. At that point, you are ready to grab your license plate light, thread the connector through the central hole. You can just slide the license plate light through, and then the last bit is going to be to install the washer plates. There's a step in that washer, and you want that step to go towards the grommet, because that step is just serving to squeeze that grommet a little bit more than if it wasn't there at all. The installation space starts to get a little tight, but let's try that again. So you kind of place the washer over the grommet. It's a little hard at an angle like this. It's much easier if you hold everything vertical. Let's try that view. And these are the, there we go. You really just need it to kind of catch so you can engage it with a Phillips screwdriver. And you're going to need to provide a decent amount of pressure down to keep your Phillips engaged, but it's going to bite down into the plastic bosses of the license plate light. Again, kind of get it set. Put the step side of that washer down, and that washer is going to kind of locate around that plastic boss on the light itself and actually squeeze harder on the grommet. So you should feel yourself bottom out, and once you feel that bottom out, there is no point in really going at it. But at that point, you should have a fairly, there's be some compliance there, but it's going to be pretty snug. So everything here should be nice and snug. Everything should be pointed at kind of the same angle with respect to the tail or the turn signals. Now actually, before we install the fender limiter onto the motorcycle, there's one more thing that we actually should install before we take it over to the bike, and that's going to be the supplied rubber grommet that's really going to seal around the three wiring looms up into the tail section of the bike, give you more or less a waterproof seal. So if you flip the fender eliminator over, you'll see there's this kind of rectangular squarish hole in the base plate where that plastic kind of snout or boss on the tail section of the bike is going to pass through, and this is going to kind of hang out right at the exit of that boss. And so we're eventually going to choke this grommet all the way up, but we will start with feeding it through, take the largest of the connectors, which is going to be the license plate light, And don't break the tab off the connector, but you do have to stretch the grommet over this connector, and that's just the one slightly painful part of this process, but then it's much easier after that, where you one by one feed the turn signal connectors through it, and you can kind of slowly move that grommet into position. Once you get the 3 cable looms through there, take that opportunity to kind of get everything close to how you want it. Then kind of fold things back and feed them through that big square hole in the fender eliminator. That's just going to prep us up for getting this onto the bike. We don't at this point need to go really tight, because it's going to be useful to have all this cabling when we're, all the kind of extra loom when we're pulling this up to the bike. Okay, so now when we're getting ready to install the fender eliminator onto the motorcycle, all the wiring set up with that grommet, bring one of the K-lock nuts, the lock nuts that's supplied with the kit, with you. Just because once you get in position, you can spin one nut down and it'll make everything else in that process easier to kind of maneuver. But just like how we kind of took the factory fender off, we're going to start by feeding the electrical connectors up through the tail section, through that plastic section in the undertail. And obviously you start with the license plate light because it's the biggest connector, but then get all 3, keep them, call it equal tension across them, and all we're going to do is line up the 4 studs with the 4 holes. And like I said, just pick one of the studs that you have easy access to, and by hand just spin the nut all the way down. You can do that by hand, and then at that point you can walk away and grab the other nuts to get them notionally installed. So if you go back to the top side of the bike, once you've got one nut kind of hand spun down, grab your other 3 supplied locking nuts and spin them down on the studs. And we like the studs because not only does it give you a super clean kind of underside appearance, but you're not futzing with loose hardware. So your 4 studs are in exactly the right pattern, and so they're all available just to work on one side of the bike at a time. Now, because the through holes in this bike are a little bigger than some of the others, there's going to be a little shift. You can see the license plate or the turn signals can kind of jiggle left to right, and that's just going to be up to you to center that as best you can by eye, so that you don't have your turn signals kind of pointed out in one direction. And you can always make very slight tweaks to this just by loosening up those nuts and adjusting. But once you get to a good base alignment, tighten up, don't go full tight, and one just on one at a time. Kind of walk yourself around in a star pattern, in a cross pattern, just so you develop torque relatively evenly on your fork. And if you're using a power driver like this, I would always recommend just grabbing a ratchet at the end, just so that by hand you can determine whether there's sufficient bolt torque developed. You don't have to go overboard here. You should feel nice solid resistance, and you should feel that your fender eliminator is ultra solid. You shouldn't be able to move your fender eliminator by hand once it's tight. Once you've got the bolts tight, all we have to do is finish up the wiring, and we're going to go back under the bike to seat the grommet, and then we'll come back up here to finish connecting everything. So if you go back down to the bottom side of the bike, the last thing we have to do down here anyways is button up the wiring. And so, like we kind of talked about, there's a little bit of extra loom down here to give us some working room for this grommet. And we're just going to really jam this round grommet into this rectangular hole, and the inner lip of that grommet is going to act like a barb and kind of retain it for the life of the bike. And the key is kind of start, if there's that kind of square hole, you're going to start on the top surface, You kind of have to hook your fingers around, use that loom, but shove in the top portion of that grommet, and then it's much easier with two hands. Kind of march your way around and push it in. Now once you get most of the way in, you should feel it kind of suck itself in, but at that point you can grab the looms on the top side. You don't want to have it suck in any of the grommet on both flanges, but it's a little hard sometimes to know which one you're pulling on, but get the 3 connectors. There we go, that's the one I wanted. They don't have to be super duper tight, but you should have a little bit of play, but then otherwise it should be snug. And that's just going to keep vibration down, but it's also going to fill up that gap. So there's not going to be any wire chafing, and there's not going to be road spray and stuff like that just pouring into the tail section of your bike. So you should have a really clean, kind of trimmed out seal there. At that point, you're done with the wiring, at least on the bottom side. So up top, the last thing we have to do is connect all the 3 2-pin connectors for the turn signals and the license plate light. And it's going to be really hard to see, but I've pulled that boot back as far as possible. Thankfully, all you have to do is match up colors and connectors, and it should be fairly straightforward. Realistically, the only thing that we're going to deal with is we have this big U-shaped grommet that we can pass. It's where the brake light loom is already going through, so we can repack that grommet with the now it'll be 4 looms, and that should slide down. At that point, really I'm going to start with the license plate light, but there's really no requirement that that's where you, and you can always key them, or you see how they're keyed with like a little notch on one end, so even from a distance I can kind of see which direction it's going to line up to. At that point I can actually push them right in. Next I'm going to do the gray, because that's the easiest one to see. And apologies if you can't really see. Hopefully you can hear the connections being made, but you should not have at least as much problem with the connection if you were able to get them disconnected in the first step. I've got one more at the black. Maybe you can see that one. I at least got out a little bit, but they're keyed, so there's truly but one way they can go back together. Hallelujah. So once you've got that, then you can unroll that giant boot, and from a wire management perspective, because we've got a little extra, what I prefer to do, and you will see like your license plate light's going to have a little bit more than the others, is to kind of take advantage of that large boot and feed a coil of your extra into that boot as well. The good news is there is this cover, so as long as you can see, you can kind of tuck a whole loop of that loom in there. It should be very secure. But then you just square up that U-shaped grommet, and that's it. At that point, as long as everything's tight, you can put down that tool tray and you're good. Putting the seat back on is as simple as using those 2 notches to slide yourself on the 400s. You kind of jiggle your way back until you connect that front post. We're good to go. Now once you got the rider seat clicked in position, all you have to do is install the license plate with the dealer supplied hardware. I recommend doing a quick systems check of the turn signals and the license plate light to make sure everything's functional. But otherwise, the installation is complete for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator on the Ninja 400. Give you a couple extra views as we kind of walk around the bike. You can tell there's very minimal kind of gaps to the body from the lights. There's no interferences, and as you sweep underneath the motorcycle, you can see there's no exposed hardware, and the wiring is very well sealed with that grommet up into the tail section of the motorcycle. With that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to buy our products direct from our website, check us out at www.vagabondmotorsports. Our products are also for sale for your Prime members on Amazon and eBay. Thank you.